Great. Well, everyone, welcome to the fifth panel for Data Innovation Day 2015. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the director of the Center for Data Innovation. Appreciate all of you who have joined us all day through all of our panels. This fifth panel is going to be on startups, entrepreneurship, and new business models in the data economy. We have a really fantastic set of guests to talk about these issues. Let me briefly introduce them and we'll jump right into the questions. So we have Joel Gorin, Senior Advisor of GovLab at NYU, Hudson Hollister, who's the Executive Director of the Data Transparency Coalition, Brian Norris, who's the CIO of Persio. Is that how you say it? You say Persio, right?
It's Persio, but yeah, everybody does that.
I missed the accent on it.
Yeah.
And Rachel Thomas, who's the Executive Director of the Data Driven Marketing Institute, and John Zoshak, who's the Policy Manager at Fiscal Node. So welcome, all of you, for joining us here today. And Brian, I want to start with you, just because your company provides data science and engineering talent to a lot of different customers. So I thought maybe you could start us off with kind of the big picture. What are the main challenges that a lot of companies are trying to solve today with data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, a lot of folks jump straight to the data without really asking the question of what they're trying to solve. So, our company is a new big data startup here in Indianapolis, really focusing in on a couple of verticals such as healthcare, manufacturing, and marketing kind of across the board. But ultimately, what we're doing and looking at are helping clients ask the right questions. So, thinking strategically about their data, thinking about not just thinking about data they have, but as the Internet of Things starts to explode and is exploding, data that they can go collect as part of their overall data strategy. And then certainly open data. There's just, as you all know, a tranche of open information coming from all directions, both globally and locally. And there's a lot of opportunity to leverage that within their solutions and the things that they do. So we help them focus on all of that first, and then dive into the data science and start building the fun predictive algorithms and the things in which really start to move the needle from an operations and their business perspective.
Yeah, and Rachel, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the advertising industry. Advertisers are kind of the leaders in using data often. They're kind of the pioneers in some cases for different types of techniques. When you see some of the new businesses that are out there, what are they doing? What are some interesting ways advertisers are using data?
Sure. So I apologize. You guys will have to let me know if my connection is having trouble. My computer is telling me it is, but I will try to join you as best I can. In the meantime, so I was late jumping on because I just jumped off of an amazing Data Innovation Day panel with 4 data-driven marketing experts who were talking about what we are seeing in the marketing and advertising space, and in particular, less about the marketing, more about the consumers. So it's not a surprise to anybody in the marketing space that data is important, that we have a data-driven way of life. Actually, marketers have considered themselves to be data-driven for over 100 years at this point. What's new and interesting isn't the analytics, that it's the speed with which that data can be used, it's the technology with which it can be applied, and the relevance with which it can be provided to services. But even more so, what we delved into in our event today was data-driven consumerism, the rise of consumers having access to perhaps not quite as much data as marketers do, but getting close these days in terms of consumers' abilities to meet marketers where they are, to have actual two-way conversations and relationships with brands, and also to leverage data themselves and even analytics and sort of predictive modeling to understand what the best offers are for them that they should take a brand up on or look elsewhere.
Great, and let me, Joel, bring you in on this conversation as well, because your study that just recently came out, not too recent, now it's almost a year old, on the Open Data 500, you looked at a lot of companies that are innovating in the data space, specifically using open data. What are the challenges that you're seeing in this space? What are the opportunities? How do you see this trend moving?
Yeah, it's a very we're at a very interesting time. I think what we're seeing is that a number of companies, I mean, in our study, 500 U.S.-based companies, it's now up to about 600, are using open data as a key resource, and these are everything from some of the classic kind of information companies like, you know, Reed Elsevier and Thomson Reuters that have used data in this way for a long time, to some new startups that are using open government data on health or financial services or, you know, energy or the environment or any number of sectors. So we're seeing that people are really beginning to understand the potential, particularly of open government data, which is just a huge resource. But at the same time, a lot of that data is in pretty bad shape. You know, it can be in technologically kludgy formats, it can be out of date, it can be inaccurate. So what we're seeing, I think, is we're beginning to see like people starting to grapple with how do you take this resource and actually make it usable and workable, and that's going to be one of the big hurdles over the next, I think, couple of years, is to see how efficiently we can do that, and how efficiently we can do that, particularly for the data sets that are going to be most important and have the most leverage.
Well, let's stay on that point for a minute, because I mean that is kind of the big question going forward. I mean, especially with the open data movement, so much of the motivation is really around, you know, can open data lead to economic growth, job creation, you know,
Right.
other positive social benefits as well. But there's a really strong interest in the economic benefits. Have you gotten any lessons already about how we translate from, you know, this resource, this kind of untapped resource, to actual economic growth?
Well, it's clearly happening, and you know, you can look at it either on a granular level or on a kind of 50,000-foot level. I mean, at the high level, the most commonly quoted statistic is McKinsey's estimate that what they would call liquid data is worth somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year to the global economy. A lot of people would take that estimate with a grain of salt, but at the same time, it gives you a sense of the kind of order of magnitude. And other studies that have been done, for example, in the European Union or the UK or, you know, other countries around the world are showing, I would say, if it's not trillions, it's most likely hundreds of billions. So it's a significant resource one way or another. What we've been trying to do through the Open Data 500 study, and now through a series of open data roundtables where we're bringing together federal agencies with the people who use their data, is to really figure out where it's being used most effectively, and how do you make that sort of transaction, particularly from government to the business community, smoother and more efficient. And I think some of the places we're seeing some real interest now, and probably some of the biggest opportunities, are going to be around healthcare, where you're just seeing an explosion of interest in many, many different areas. And I think also some really rapidly growing interest around energy and the environment, as well as some of the more traditional areas like financial services and others. So I think to the extent that the demand is becoming clearer and the potential is becoming clearer, I think we're going to see that the available data and the potential of that resource also gears up pretty fast.
Yeah. So John, why don't we go to you for a minute? I mean, you're kind of the poster child for a data open data startup, or a data-driven startup that, you know, we want to see more of. So maybe you can take a minute, maybe introduce your company and see how you think, talk a little bit about how you think data plays a role in the growth of your company and others in this industry.
Sure, it's so funny to hear Rachel talk, because, you know, the marketers have been using data for hundreds of years, but governments have been kind of dealing with data for maybe a decade, and it's pretty bad. So, you know, what FiscalNote does is we take all that unstructured government data that they're kind of dumping to us, and we make it usable for clients across a number of different ways. So, you know, right now we have a legislative tracking product called Proxy, which enables organizations to track, and this is state and federal. So, you know, federal is, you know, more easy, but still not great, but the states are just a gigantic mess. So we take all that messy state data and we enable organizations to track the issues that matter to them across 50 states. And then we take that data again and run all these predictive analytics over it. So we've actually gotten to the point where we can predict the chance of a bill passing correctly 94% of the time. So we have clients that use that for everything from resource allocation in terms of lobbyists to prioritizing their main issues for the year. So it's sort of like taking all this unstructured data that the states are giving us and unlocking it and making it useful for clients.
Mm-hmm. And Hudson, let me bring you in on this as well. So, Data Transparency Coalition is the reason that the Data Act passed, and that we have more government data coming out. What do you think? I mean, how do you think this will evolve over the next few years? Will we get the kind of cleaned up, more useful data that Joel's talking about to get the kinds of companies that John's doing, or what do we need to have happen in this space?
Well, for the background for our audience, the ones that don't follow federal legislation as closely as I do, which is I hope nobody, the last year, and it requires the U.S. federal government to transform its spending information from disconnected documents into open data, and our coalition, which is made up of tech companies, lobbied for the passage of that law. Beyond spending, as you point out, Daniel, beyond spending, there are many other areas of government information, federal and state, that could be expressed as open data, could be expressed as standardized and searchable information, but are not. Our goal is to persuade policymakers that they need to make changes. Sometimes this means passing laws, sometimes this means persuading agencies to make regulatory changes, but in each case it means that policymakers who don't usually pay attention to the plumbing, don't usually pay attention to data formats, have to decide that this information needs to be liberated. We started with federal spending. This year we're expanding the campaign beyond federal spending to also include financial regulatory reporting and legislative information. Now, why do we have those three? Why are we focusing on federal spending, financial reg, and law and legislation? It's because we think those three are the most valuable. They offer the most, compared to other areas, they offer so many commercial opportunities of the kind that Fiscal Note's pursuing. As we get bigger, if we get bigger, we may be able to acquire the bandwidth to move into new areas: energy, healthcare, education. Throughout each of these, there are so many places where government information is still trapped in PDF documents or not available at all. That's our challenge.
That's great. It's very interesting to me, as someone who both is interested in data and policy and the technology, but also the politics of it. That this is a really interesting situation, because we finally, the Data Transparency Coalition, represents a true interest that was unrepresented for so long. This valuable data has been there for more than the 2 or 3 years that Hudson has been working on these issues, but we didn't have an institutional force to really push Congress and push legislators to start caring about these issues. And so I suspect that at the state and local level, we're going to see something as well. We've certainly seen a growth in civic tech and larger movement there. But Joel, going back to you, you've seen both federal data and state and local data become very useful. Do you see this kind of push? Do you see state legislators responding to a political force saying data?
Well, I think it's starting to happen, and if you look at least at what's happened in the U.S. in the open data movement, it's been very interesting. You've had a lot of movement at the federal level, going back at least to 2009, which President Obama's one of his first acts when he was elected was to proclaim open government and the open government policies that included open data. You also saw a lot of stuff happening around the same time in a number of cities around the country, including San Francisco, Washington D.C., New York City. But the states, for whatever reason, really lagged. So I think it's really just now that we're beginning to see a number of states realizing the potential of their data. And what's interesting here is I think there's two levels to look at it. So one level is you're going to see a lot of both nonprofits and for-profit companies beginning to use that data in ways that begin to create really useful websites or apps or whole companies using, for example, state of California data could support a lot of initiatives and a lot of companies, and I think people are starting to mind that. On the other hand, there are a number of areas like education, or somebody was telling me the other day about incarceration data, where there are state-by-state data sets that you really want to look at a national level. But I mean, John, as you know, I think you were saying, when you think each state's data is a mess or the federal government's data is a mess, when you now try to somehow make something meaningful out of 50 different data sets on the same thing, it gets really difficult. Now, there have been some companies and nonprofits that have been doing this. One of the best known is probably Great Schools, which has found some way to look at education data in all 50 states and develop ratings and rankings of schools in each state. But even there, they can't really do state-to-state comparisons. So I think one of the things we're going to really see at a state level is not just a push for better data state by state, but on some of these big areas like education, criminal justice, healthcare, and so on. I think we're going to see a real push for across-country harmonization, and that's going to not only make it possible to do more stuff within a given state, but to get a picture of how the nation is doing on a state level and to use that state-by-state national data in some really important ways.
Yeah, John, maybe you can talk about this as well.
Joel said on that front.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Sure, thanks. So, I couldn't agree more with what Joel and Hudson have both said in terms of the wonderful work that's being done in the last few years to make sure that there are new data sets that are available. But, one of the things that we're seeing, those of us who've been using whatever government data is available for many, many years, is actually less data available in traditional sources. You've seen in the last few years huge attacks on the American Community Survey, which is part of the census data that comes in every year. Congress in the House actually, passed a movement to just roll back the ACS entirely. We were able to fight that off, but that's somewhere that marketers and businesses generally have used that data for 10 years, a decade, in terms of where do you put your new business, where do you find your new workers, where is there a niche market that hasn't been served yet. So making sure that we are paying attention to preserving existing data sets as well. Another sort of bizarre little area out of the Commerce Department is around the data that NTIS provides on things like Social Security data, pulling all of the data from the states, the messy data sets of the states around who has passed away. That's a really important data set, strangely, for marketers in order to know who not to contact, who to leave alone, right? Not just to save money for your business, but so as not to offend those that are hurting, right? It is becoming more and more difficult to get access to that death master file in order to, properly go through your lists and remove folks as appropriate. So I want to make sure that's my plug for traditional data sets continuing to be available as we open up all these new great areas as well.
Yeah, and Daniel,
that's
if I can jump
really important point. Yeah.
Sure, if I can jump in as well. 2 points. From a federal level, as a clinician in the health space, I couldn't agree more that there's this large push into utilization and understanding of open information. The FDA recently released information that's been out for years, so adverse events information, recalls information through OpenFDA. I built a open source research app on top of it called Research AE, and within a matter of a very short period of time, 6,000 users are now using that platform to conduct research every day on adverse events, recalls, etc. So it's not even just about new information, it's about getting information out there in consumable formats that we can start to innovate on top of rather rapidly at a minimal investment rather than a large investment. Had that had to be a large investment, that app might not have been created. And then on the state front, I'm very lucky to live here in Indiana. We had our first civic hackathon in Indianapolis about last year. Since then, it's spawned a huge conversation between civic leaders at the state level, at the city level, and the development community. And later today, you'll start seeing some announcements about a massive innovation challenge across the state for a year-long series of events to connect civic needs with open data with local innovators. Very exciting stuff. In addition to that, we fast forward a year, by being able to show legislators what the output of all of this innovation could be, we now have a bill introduced in the House for this legislative session that's around open data for Indiana. So I think part of it is also an ability to start showing legislators what it means at a state level versus a federal level, and we'll start to see a lot of action.
Thanks. John, I just wanted to turn to you for a minute to pick up on Joel's point about the need for harmonization and standardization data sets. And I mean, you're pulling data from 50 states, and it seems like 50 states aren't working together to make your life easier.
Right.
What do you need to have happen in this space? Or are you seeing any states that are starting to reach out and say, if we're all going to make legislative data available, why don't we do it the same way?
So no, to answer the second question, we have not heard that states are banding together quite yet to release their data in a certain way. But I think, around all this talk around releasing the data sets and getting the data sets out in public and keeping data sets, I mean, that's definitely the first step. Then there's kind of the second step of like making sure that data is machine readable. That's the key, is like making sure that this data is in a format that we can actually do something with. Because it's one thing to dump a bunch of data on the public. It's another thing to make that data useful. And that's like, what we do here is we try to make all this data useful. And we're getting by, right? Like not all of this stuff is, like in the best format or, but we come up with all these technological solutions to get around it. We have scrapers, we have, all sorts of things to kind of like flesh out the information. But, for me, what I'd love to see, and what I think government should be focusing on is maybe less like trying to create a portal for, people to interact with it, just getting the data out there to private industry and nonprofits so they can create the applications that the public can use. So anything from, something a citizen could use to track a bill that they're interested in to something, an organization could use to track the thousands of bills that they're interested in. I mean, to me, it's all about getting the data in a usable format for, private industry and nonprofits to create the apps for the public to use.
No, that's a great point. And if you look at traffic data, for example, you see a lot of cities that they were collecting this data and they kind of leapfrogged making their own app, gave it away to Waze or Google, these kind of third parties to integrate into their own systems. Brian, I wanted to turn back to you, and we've been talking about open data, and I know you work with companies who are not just doing open data; they're also just kind of interested in data-driven innovation overall. How big of a piece of the pie, I guess, is open data? We have a lot of conversations about it, but should we be talking about this bigger picture of data-driven innovation that's going on in the private sector and all the data is held by the private industry as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that it's starting to come into the conversation where, not too long ago, it really wasn't even a part of the conversation. So, for example, we'll have clients ask lots of questions. We'll use a crime as a proxy. Hey, I have a business that relies upon crime information. It may not be, a police department, but it might be a product that I sell into areas that help protect citizens against crime or alert fire departments or alert police departments. But I don't really know where I can go to get information to determine where's the best bang for my buck. Where should I go? Health data as well. How am I doing against other health providers? There's been an unprecedented amount of financial information and health quality information released from CMS over the last 12 months. You're starting to see a lot of questions and saying, I can use this information for all kinds of things. I can blend it with my current information and get a better competitive intel, if you will, against other companies in my space. I can also use that information to just basically benchmark and see how I'm doing. So, I mean, we're seeing a lot more people asking the question of what's out there, what's available that I can start to bring in with my traditional data, than prior to which the questions were more like, what can I do with the data I have?
Great. So I want to switch directions for a moment. On one of our earlier panels, the issue of what advertisers do with data came up. And so I promised the panelists on that panel that I would ask this question to Rachel, because I said, we really need to hear from the experts on this. So the question that came up, it was in regards to the Internet of Things and all the data that's being collected for really useful purposes. And we had one panelist that said, raised the question of, do we want advertisers to have access to this data? What might they do with it? Is this something we should be concerned about? So I said, well, we're going to have an expert later on. So I wanted to give this question to Rachel and have you respond and make this part of the conversation.
No, I'm so glad you asked. It's an incredibly high priority for DMA and its members right now is addressing that and figuring out where are the lines that are appropriate. But I think one of the really important lines that has always been there that will continue to be there, one of the technology moves too fast to have laws necessarily that always regulate these areas. So we have in the self-regulatory world a set of principles that we try to make sure apply no matter where the technology, what the next wearable, the Internet of Things, wherever it goes, still applies. So one of those important for us is if the data is coming to us for marketing purposes, that we not pass it on for other purposes. So, I think one of the biggest concerns that we hear from consumers and regulators, the Federal Trade Commission first among them, is, okay, marketing, advertising, the worst thing that can happen to you if your data is used for marketing or advertising purposes is that you get an offer or a product that is relevant to you or not relevant to you, period. However, the concern really comes in, will that data be used for other purposes? Like, is it going to be used, is healthcare data coming off my wearable not going to just be used to offer me, the towels to mop up my sweat after I've worked out, but is it going to be passed on to your healthcare provider to say, you didn't meet your number of steps today, should your healthcare premiums be increased? So for us, one of the big concerns, again, is making sure that it's clear as much what marketers and advertisers are not doing with data as what they are in these innovative spaces. And because that's an area where consumers deserve to have confidence that we've got laws in those areas around not having to be concerned that eligibility decisions will be made about their lives because they used this cool new device and advertisers were involved in that data flow.
It seems like this is really important, especially, this panel is about the kind of startups, entrepreneurship, and new business models. And we do, of course, want to see lots of innovation in this space. And we want to see companies experimenting and trying new things and using data for purposes they never really considered before. So it seems like having these types of frameworks that you talked about is really important so that we kind of pave the path for new companies to emerge.
Yeah, and I think having those frameworks, having the public, policymakers, regulators feel confident that those traditional principles that we've had still apply in new and emerging areas is incredibly important in order to have the opportunity to continue to use the data in new and innovative ways. So, again, I think one of the big focuses is keeping that drumbeat going, that, we're paying attention to this in order to have, the Internet of Things go in all the new and interesting ways that we need it to. Dan, one other thing, Daniel, is, you've heard this before, but the value of that data, I think it was Joel spoke earlier to the value of the government data, and McKinsey's perhaps questionable, but definitely up their numbers in terms of virtual data, soft data, flowing data, just in data-driven marketing, which is, just the data, not all of the sales that flow from the use of data, but just the use of data itself. $156 billion to the U.S. economy in 1 year, 675,000 jobs, and that is just the nucleus of a much larger ripple effect in terms of economic output. And that's just what we're doing today. Who knows what we'll be able to do tomorrow? So the reasons on both the business and the consumer side for keeping those options open are incredibly large ones.
Hudson, I want to pull you into this conversation. Especially, there's this important idea in the business world about open innovation, or this idea that firms should be looking not just internally but also externally for ideas about the products and services they create and basically how they innovate, what they bring to market. And it seems that data-driven innovation is a really big part of this. And so, since you work with a lot of companies in this tech space, in this data space, are they thinking along those lines? The open innovation and data-driven innovation is being related?
I think most of them wouldn't use the term innovation because you can use that term to mean almost anything you want. Most of the companies that we work with are pursuing one of three business models. Some of them want to republish government information and make money off the advertising or off subscriptions. I think Fiscal Note's probably in that category. Some of them have analytics platforms and they want to help government or help the private sector find insights using their analytics platforms. And with government information as poorly organized as it is, they spend most of their resources on ETL. They spend most of their resources on extracting, transforming, and loading the information. They realize that their analytics platforms could deliver better insights for less money if we had better data standards. So that's the second category. The third category are the ones who want to build the TurboTax for everything. If government adopted consistent data formats for the information that it collects, take for instance in the Data Act requires consistent data standards for all of the reports that federal grantees have to submit to government. If we had those data standards, it would become possible for someone to build the TurboTax of grant reporting. That hasn't happened yet because up until last May, there was no mandate for those consistent data standards. Basically, all of the business models that I see, or all the ones at least that motivate companies to support our campaign because it costs money to join, they've got to invest in joining our coalition, all of them are about republication, analytics, or automating compliance. And I think all three of those businesses are going to grow and change in the future. In some ways they will start combining. But for now I'm comfortable. I'm a lawyer, so I love categories. For now I'm comfortable with describing it in those categories.
Thanks. And Brian, I want to kind of pose the same question to you. Just in terms of, so Hudson talked about the companies that he's working with have really these kind of three, frameworks for their business models. And one of these other models that isn't part of that, I guess, is the idea of open innovation or bringing ideas from outside the firm. I'm wondering if you're seeing that.
Yeah, we're starting to see it in a couple of ways. So I mean, the first is all pure strategy. So asking the questions and then taking the gloves off, if you will, around data they have and starting to look broader. And then the one that we haven't talked about is more of an ecosystem approach. So you're starting to see beyond governments, you're seeing businesses start to ask themselves the question, should I open my data up or shouldn't I? Should I put it out there in a way that creates the Apple App Store, if you will, and allow others to innovate on top of my platform and help me more rapidly move forward with an ecosystem? So you're seeing large amounts of APIs, thousands and thousands of APIs being put out there that help extend these platforms. We've all seen that in the social sphere, but now we're starting to see these non-traditional businesses, and in the health space, you're starting to see a lot of questions of, should I de-identify it and put it out there and allow innovators to innovate on top of this to help me manage a population? So I think that, and maybe this is just my personal bet, that over the next 5 years we're going to see a lot of privatized businesses jump into this open data space and start having a lot of information out there that's going to be pretty darn intriguing to mesh with government data.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, the pharmaceutical companies that have come together in the past year to create research networks, to me, is a great example of that, because you had these groups that were traditionally at odds, very competitive, who have decided that they're better off working together than working individually. And there's a net win for consumers. And Rachel, I want to go to you on this question as well, because this is obviously something where advertisers have managed to have some success, and in some ways might be, again, kind of the leaders in the space. I mean, certainly online, there's aggregate data on consumer behavior, and in other spaces as well, that is really useful. That wouldn't exist if companies didn't come together and say, we're better off sharing than not sharing.
Daniel, if I can add to that just quickly, one of the interesting bits of work that I'm aware of in the last 18 months is Matt Harding, who's been at Georgetown and at Stanford and many other interesting places, taking the sort of consumer behavior data that you're talking about from marketers, aggregated, anonymized, it's trending data, but using it to inform sort of the reverse of what we've been talking about here, using it to inform policy decisions, particularly in the space around data deserts, or pardon me, not data deserts, food deserts, and what food folks have access to, what nutritional options they have, et cetera, and working with USDA. So I think Brian's right on the money that companies or industries more generally sort of aggregating that data and figuring out how to partner with it back and forth in both ways. And that also, it's an additional incentive in terms of the work that, Hudson and folks are doing on, and Don on trying to get more government out of data in the first place. We also have data we can provide.
Great. So the last question I have for the panel is really kind of I want to go back to the government role of government data and what government agencies should be thinking about. We consistently have policymakers, asking, is what we're doing with data enough? Should we be doing more? What's the impact of our decisions on both new entrants, on startups, but also on existing businesses? So I'd love to get your feedback, and we'll just I'll open this up to the panel for everyone to comment on. But what should government agencies and policymakers be thinking about the impact of their decisions on companies and on you?
I think federal and other government agencies should see all of the information that they take in and all of the information that they put out as opportunities for the open data transformation. As one example, this is something that I've had the chance to discuss with John's team at Fiscal Note. If government agencies that issue regulations could be persuaded to put them out as data instead of as sequential documents, then somebody might invent a way to help regulated entities comply more automatically. The notion of automated regulatory compliance, that's not the first thing that you think of when you think about open data, but it could be a potential consequence down the road if government agencies start seeing all the information, even what they've normally tended to regard as, oh, these are the documents that our lawyers are supposed to draft. If they start seeing everything as an opportunity to transform information into structured and searchable data.
I think that's exactly right. So I was saying earlier, we really would like the government to focus more on getting that data out in a usable format for the companies out there that are utilizing it, so machine readable. And it's funny, I get asked a lot, oh, isn't it better for you guys if the data is more fragmented, and then you can come up with all these workarounds that your competitors won't be able to do? And yeah, that's what the incumbents in this space because they're the ones that get all these crazy workarounds and have a terrible interface and are on the market doing this stuff, but we don't care about doing that stuff. We want to do the cool stuff at Fiscal Note. We don't care about, scraping all this random data and, aggregating 50 random data streams. We want it all smooth. We want that part to be easy. The hard part, the cool stuff, the stuff we want to do and the stuff we do at Fiscal Note, that stuff is the analytics, the predictions, the, making that data usable, unlocking that data and making it usable. So no, we don't want a fragmented system. We don't think that's advantageous. We really want to do cool stuff.
Yeah, Joel.
So, Daniel, I can jump in there. You're absolutely spot on in terms of our thinking as well over at the DMA. The data, the algorithm is only as good as the data you put into it, and so the smoother the data, the better. So 100% agree that it behooves government to provide the data in formats that are going to be helpful. I think to follow on what Hudson said, though, in terms of, every bit of data the government has is an opportunity, I think that's absolutely true. But I also think it behooves us to really communicate with government what the priorities should be among that data, so that, because they're not going to have the resources. We don't have resources in private sector enough to do everything and every opportunity. So where do we see the biggest opportunities in terms of the private sector and making sure that we're having that robust conversation with government? And there's already a lot of good work being done there. I think particularly the opportunities for small business around understanding government regulations is a huge one. That's one of the biggest difficulties we have at DMA with our small business members. The big guys have government affairs departments, they've got regulatory departments. The little guys, they're looking at our self-regulatory code to make sure that every regulation that's relevant to them is built into our code. They become DMA members because that's their filter. The ability to have greater resources to provide them in terms of compliance would be incredibly, incredibly valuable.
Sounds like those smaller members could use Fiscal Note.
Yeah, we'll talk.
And Daniel, I'd add this. So as we move beyond just simply getting the data out there, we really need some resiliency in making sure that the information is stable. So as we're in an API machine-enabled world, we saw not too recently a government shutdown that essentially shut down open data servers. that essentially shut down businesses that build products on top of those servers. And so it's one thing to put the data out, it's another thing to be spawning an ecosystem in which you're driving economic value, and those companies are dependent upon that information to continue to drive their products forward. So I think it's important that as we move into this next phase is that we start having discussions around, what does it mean if I were to have an issue? How do I economically keep this data flowing? And it's not just a cool one-year project that I move on to the next cool one-year project the following year, especially if I have companies that have built products on top of it. These are unsolved problems and challenges because we're simply focused on getting the information out, but I think we need to start having that conversation.
That's a great point. And Joel, are you back online with us? I know you dropped off there for a moment. Well, I think you're online, but we can't hear you. So we'll stop there. But this is obviously a conversation that will be continuing throughout the coming years. The importance of government in ensuring that the data infrastructure they create remains reliable for companies is something that I think is underappreciated, and something that hopefully we'll be able to educate more people about in the policy world. This has come up kind of repeatedly in this conversation, from Rachel's DPS to the Data Act to the state legislative databases to the points that you were just making, Brian. So thanks to all of you for joining the conversation today, sharing your thoughts. Thanks to everyone who's participated on the conversation on Twitter today. We welcome your input and suggestions for what we should be focusing on in the weeks and months ahead. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.